In my last video, I briefly discussed the problems that plague the costumes in Marvel's Avengers, but after thinking about it for a bit, I've realized that I have a lot more to say. I do think that I did a pretty good job laying out the three main problems with the costume in the game, namely that they stick too close to reality, they make unnecessary changes to the source material, and they reuse assets. But I only looked at one costume to demonstrate this, which, in fairness, was a pretty bad costume, but I didn't look at the worst that this game has to offer. So I wanted to take a real deep dive into Avengers costumes using the character Iron Man. Why Iron Man? Well, for one, he's a character I really like. Honestly, him, Cap, and Spider-Man are really the only characters in Avengers that I actually care about. I already picked on Cap a lot in my last video, so I want to give another character the spotlight. And I don't want to dive into Spider-Man for a whole bunch of reasons. I'll just put him on the screen. Another reason I chose Iron Man is that he has a lot of costumes, so there's just more to discuss. Anyway, let's get into it. Iron Man has 24 unique skins, and 89 skins in total. So that means that 65 of his costumes, about 73%, are recolors. I got a comment on my last video saying that I didn't talk about the recolors enough, and yeah, I didn't. I thought everyone had already beaten that horse to death, but apparently not. I didn't even know that this many of his suits were recolors. I thought like half of them would be recolors, but 73%? Wow. Anyway, I won't focus too much on them here, I just wanted to point out that the abundance of recolors is a problem. I mostly want to focus on the unique skin models and the problems that they have. First, I want to look at the suits based off of stuff from the comics. This is the main reason I even wanted to do this, so let's just get it out of the way. I'm going to go from best to worst, with there being three main categories for these comic suits. Good, okay, and bad. So let's start with good. The illustrious suit is clearly meant to be Iron Man's classic suit. It does a pretty good job of recreating that armor. It's not one-to-one to the source material, but it updates the costume in a way that I think makes sense. All the colors are in the right spots, all the design elements are there, and it has this weird kind of retro-futurism look to it that I think is really neat. Granted, I'm not the biggest fan of classic Iron Man, so maybe hardcore classic Iron Man fans won't like this costume, but I think it's pretty cool. Something really quick I just want to point out, this isn't a criticism, but on the preview image for the suit, as well as concept art for it, you'll see that the eyes don't light up, but in the actual game they do. Not a huge problem, again, not a criticism, but just something a little weird. I don't think anyone else has ever really pointed that out. So I'd give that suit like an 8 out of 10. Moving on to the okay section, we have the silver centurion costume. I think a lot of people will be surprised that I didn't put this one in good, but I have a few issues with it. I think the shoulder pads are a little too thin and weak looking. I feel like they should be thicker, sturdier. And because they move with his arms, if he's standing still, they kind of droop down a little bit. I don't really like that. But like the main issue I have, and this is a really small, silly issue, but the main issue I have with this thing is on the boots, he has little specks of gold. I don't know why they did this. I initially thought that since this suit is mostly just a recolor of the classic suit, I thought that they didn't recolor it correctly and accidentally left in pieces of gold, but that's not true because the gold isn't on the same spots on this costume that it is on the classic suit. So they went out of their way to put gold on it. But like part of the main appeal of the costume is that it doesn't have gold on it. It's one of the few Iron Man suits that isn't red and gold. It's red and silver, but they put gold on it anyway. And I know it's just a small part, but it bothers me. It bothers me so much. I can't call it good. 6.5 out of 10. It's fine, but every now and then I see like the little gold on the boots and it pisses me off. The Iron Will suit is clearly the Mark 1. I'm putting in okay because it's a fine design. If it was an original suit, it would also just be okay, but as an adaptation of the Mark 1, it doesn't look much like the one from the comic books, which is fine. The Mark 1 in the comic books looks really silly, but I think this one strays just a little bit too far away from that suit, but it's fine. It's an okay design. 6 out of 10. Also, there's another suit in the game, it's a recolor of this one, called Iron Pyrite. I think this is supposed to be the Mark II from the comic books, which is a gold version of the Mark I. I think. I don't know. I don't know if that was intentional because it's not exactly gold. It's like kind of rusted in some areas. So I don't know what the intention of that was. If it is an attempt at doing that, also 6 out of 10. It's just whatever looking. If not, I don't know what the point of it was then. Moving on, the artificial genius suit is clearly based on that point in the comics after Civil War II, where Iron Man was effectively dead, where he uploaded his consciousness into a digital space, and then that AI copy of him would go around in his classic armor doing stuff. It was weird, but it's clearly that look. And I'm putting it here in okay because they really scuffed this costume. They like scratched it up, gave it a bunch of scratch marks, and like kind of dulled the colors. I think they did this so that it wasn't so obvious that it's literally just the classic suit with a different headpiece. But I think they took it a little too far, and it's like so different in like coloring and just how much is scratched up. It just doesn't look that much like the one from the comic books. It's fine. I'd give it a 6 out of 10, but it's not great. The original Sin armor is not the Marvel Now costume. This is a pretty common point of confusion. I myself originally thought that those two were the same, and I was totally prepared to just tear into it for looking nothing like that, but they're actually two different costumes. The original Sin suit is exclusive to the story Original Sin. It only appears in like 1 or 2 issues of that story. And this version of it is fine. The design is mostly there, but it's mostly just missing a lot of the lights that suit had. In the comic books, it had lights on like the knuckles and honestly basically everywhere you could shove a light onto. This version isn't that exaggerated with the lights, but it's mostly there. I'll give it like a 6.5 out of 10. It's just alright, but it's not good. Moving on to bad, let's start with the Bleeding Edge suit. The Bleeding Edge suit in this game looks basically nothing like the Bleeding Edge suit from the comic books, and if it wasn't titled the Bleeding Edge suit, then you'd never know it was even an attempt at that costume. Honestly, I still think it's not an attempt at that costume. I think they just named it Bleeding Edge because they thought that was a cool name, and they were completely unaware of the fact that that was also a suit from the comic books. So looking at it, if you look at the Bleeding Edge suit from the comic books, it's very slim and sleek. It's got like some really cool like gold throughout the costume. It has a helmet that looks a lot like the one from the movies, but the suit in the game doesn't look like that at all. The most jarring difference is that the game version has a lot of gray on the chest, which the comic book version didn't have at all. The only thing that's like kind of similar is that they have a kind of similar chest design for like where the arc reactor is. There's this almost X shape on it. But outside of that, they're completely different designs. I'll give this one a 3 out of 10 because, I mean, it looks fine by itself, but as an adaptation of the suit from the comic books, it's awful. Next up is the Superior Iron Man suit. With this one, if you look at the comic book one right next to the version from the video game, you'll very quickly start to notice that a lot of stuff is different. Well, one of the biggest ones right away that you'll notice is that in the comic book, circles were a pretty big part of the Superior Iron Man costume. His arc reactor was a circle, he had circles on his shoulders, circles on his hips, even the Superior Iron Man logo for the comic book, the O would be stylized to look like the circles on his costume. And in the game, none of these circles are present. His arc reactor on his chest is a hexagon, he doesn't have the circles on his shoulders or his hips, and like the more you look at it, the more you notice stuff is wrong. He's missing like a ton of lights. In the comic books, he had lights on his forearms, on his knees, running down his legs, on his feet. All of that not present in the one in the game. Also in the game, he has this big like black V on his shape that breaks up the silver, which just isn't how the chest looked in the comic books. And the big reason why the costume just doesn't look the way it did in the books, it's very obvious, and that is because from the neck down, that costume is reused from something else. So the suit they decided to cobble together and repaint to make the Superior costume doesn't look anything like the one from the comic book. And the one element that they created to separate it from that reused suit, which would be the headpiece, also doesn't look too much like the one from the comics. They're supposed to be on his ears, the ears are supposed to be circles. Again, that whole circle motif I was talking about, not present on the one in the game. The rim that lines his forehead is way too low. It's like right above his eyebrows when it should be higher at the top of his forehead to line up with his hairline. But because it's so much lower and that version of Iron Man has a widow's peak, it just makes it look like he's balding and it doesn't look good. Also, like in the game, he has a light on his forehead, right? That's a hexagon. And in the comic books, while he did have like a diamond shape on the forehead, it wasn't a light. He instead had a light on his chin. So really nothing about the costume looks the way it did in the comic books. Like the headpiece, kind of, but it's really just that. It's the headpiece and the color scheme. Everything else from a design standpoint is completely different. 3 out of 10. The Federation suit is such a head scratcher. It's based off of, I think, Space Punisher, which is a pretty obscure book where these guys called the Avengers Federation, who are like a weird Elseworlds version of the Avengers, show up. I think they're only there for like 3 panels. I think their gimmick, design-wise, is that they're like literal interpretations of the Avengers. Like Ant-Man and Wasp are actual like bug people, that kind of thing. So Iron Man, in that, the Avengers Federation, he has like a half man, half machine thing going on. Very kind of retro looking. And this suit, like, it's just a recolor of the superior armor. It's like, I don't even understand, like, what is this doing here? I'm gonna give this a, what is this even doing here, out of 10. Next up is the Ultimate Iron Man suit. And the biggest problem with this suit is simply that it's the wrong costume. So a little background here. Ultimate Marvel is this relaunch of titles that Marvel did in the early 2000s. The idea was to make a new line of comics set in a new continuity so readers could just pick it up without having to be familiar with the 50 plus years of Marvel history that had come prior to that. So Ultimate Iron Man, the character, first appeared in Ultimate Marvel Team Up, but that storyline is kind of dubious in terms of how canon it is. It's never mentioned again, I don't think, within the Ultimate Marvel universe. His real first appearance is largely considered to be his appearance in The Ultimates in 2002. And the suit he wore in The Ultimates would be his defining suit in that continuity. He wore that suit for Ultimates 1, he wore a streamlined version of it in Ultimates 2, he'd go back to wearing it in Ultimatum, he wore it in the story Ultimate Armor Wars, he wore it in the story Ultimate War, as well as Ultimate Power. The point I'm trying to make here is that even though he wore a few other suits in Ultimate Marvel, that costume from the first Ultimates is his main suit that everyone thinks of when they think Ultimate Iron Man. Whenever he shows up in anything else, it's usually that costume. The Secret Wars event from 2015 that had a bunch of different multiverses clash into each other, in that story, he's wearing that costume. When the mainline continuity of Marvel created their own Ultimates team, they had a brief crossover with the original Ultimates, and Iron Man wears that costume. That costume is not the one that's being adapted in this game. It's instead the costume from the 10-issue miniseries titled Ultimate Iron Man. The Ultimate Iron Man miniseries wasn't bad, but it wasn't good either. It contradicted a lot of what was already established about Iron Man in the original Ultimate stories. It did a bunch of weird stuff. Like they gave him like Wolverine level healing abilities. He could heal back entire limbs. He had like blue skin as a child. Every single cell in his body was also a brain cell. That's why he was so smart. And the reason he creates the Iron Man suit, he creates it like as a kid, just kind of because. But in the Ultimates, he expressly says that the reason he creates the Iron Man suit is that he was diagnosed with a brain tumor and he wanted to do something good with the remaining years of his life, so he built the Iron Man suit to do that. And it was a mess. The Ultimate Iron Man series was a mess. So much so that eventually it was ruled to be non-canon. And what they ended up doing was, it was retconned that miniseries was actually a television series within the continuity of Ultimate Marvel. So Tony Stark licensed the the show to some company and they took a ton of liberties. And they even have Nick Fury like watch it at some point and comment on how stupid it is. So that's the costume we're dealing with here, the costume from that series. Now, like the obvious question is why? Why this costume that was only in like 3 of the 10 issues of this miniseries instead of the far more well known suit that he wore way more often in the normal Ultimates continuity? Well, the reason is actually pretty simple. If you Google Ultimate Iron Man, the first thing that shows up is the suit from the miniseries, which isn't surprising because it's titled Ultimate Iron Man. So am I suggesting that the people working on this game didn't know anything about the comic books and used Google as their main reference? No, I'm not suggesting that. I'm flat out saying that that is the case because it's the only thing that makes sense. So, the suit itself, it's the wrong suit, sure, but is it at least a good interpretation of the suit it's trying to be? No. The head shape and color scheme is generally right, but everything else is just incorrect. The suit, like the body type of the suit, just isn't right, but that has a lot to do with the character's proportions. Iron Man in the Avengers game is just really, really thin, so bulky suits just generally look weird on him. The suit in the miniseries had cannons on the forearms. I don't think he ever fired them. I think in the covers of the book, you can see him firing them, but in the actual book, he doesn't shoot them off ever. But they're supposed to be there, and they're not there in the game. On his boots, he has these two, like, prongs, these two little toes that stick out. They're not there either in the game. It's the wrong suit, which was a bad suit, adapted poorly. Like, every single step here was the wrong step. It's just awful. Awful everything. 2 out of 10, and I'm only giving it that score because I'm really nostalgic for Ultimate Marvel, but outside of that, garbage. The last one is what I consider to be the worst of Iron Man suits, and that is the Promethium armor. This is based off of the Promethium armor Iron Man wore in the Heroes Reborn storyline, which was a attempt at a reboot before they came along with the Ultimate Marvel idea. And the reason I say this one is the worst is because you can pinpoint the exact moment where the developers threw in the towel and gave up when trying to design this costume. Because if you look at the arms and the legs, you'll see that it's actually pretty close to the one from the comic books. It has that coil metal that looks like muscles, but then you get to the chest, and you can tell that's where they gave up. That's where they said, oh, fuck it, who cares? Because the chest is just reused from the original Sin costume. It's modified, of course. It has like the added vents, and the arc reactor is different, but it's built off of the original Sin costume. Same with the helmet. The helmet's the same as the original Sin costume as well. So that one just really just pisses me off because like they were almost there if they just tried a little harder, but they didn't. And it's just not, I don't think it's a good interpretation of that costume at all, especially with like the vents. How hard is it to put vents on the right spot? They're supposed to be on his back going up, but instead they're on the front of his chest curling back. It's just weird. Like it doesn't, like you would only recognize it as the Promethium armor because of the arms and the legs. If you take that out, it's just a completely different thing. And it's awful. I don't like it. And like I said, because it was close to being there, that pisses me off. And I'll give that thing 1 out of 10. Terrible. So those are all the costumes directly based off of something from the comic books. There's 10 of them. For a game that has so many costumes, Iron Man in particular having 24 unique suits, less than half of those are things based off the books, which is really weird. But moving on, we have things that are loosely inspired by other stuff. The retro suit is maybe the Mark II, the modular armor, Mark 16. I don't know. I don't know what the suit is supposed to be. I think it's just generally based off of the idea of retro Iron Man. I don't know. It's not based off of anything specific, at least not that I can tell. It's not a particularly good looking costume either. It looks kind of fat. I don't really like it. 4 out of 10. The suit Epiphany, same thing. It's a recolor, so I don't think it's expressly based off anything, but it is similar to the Mark II. 4 out of 10. The Star Boost armor is really weird because there's nothing in the comic books that looks like this. He has a few spacefaring costumes in the books, but none of them look like that. This one is actually seemingly based off of a costume from the movies. In Iron Man 3, you'll see that he very briefly uses a costume that is called the Star Boost armor. And it looks kind of like this, or I guess this suit looks kind of like that one. And it's just really weird. I don't know why they based this costume off of something from the movies. Like why not just make a completely original design if you're not going to use something from the comic books? Because all they ended up doing was making a suit that looks like a bootleg version of something from the movies, which generally is how you could describe this entire game. But yeah, I'm not really a fan of this one either. It's just fine. I'll give it a 5 out of 10. It's all right. Moving on, we have suits that are entirely original. His iconic suit, I talked about a little bit in my last video. There's a little blurb that's like 2 seconds. It's last on screen for like 2 seconds. But if you read it, what I'm going to say here is nothing new. I think Iron Man in this game is generally just too thin. He looks really frail and weak. I don't like that. And that's just generally a problem with his iconic suit. It just looks too thin. The helmet, though, is my main issue with it. It looks really stupid. He looks like he's constantly just like has a derp face on. The rest of the armor is fine. Like the design of the armor itself is fine. I think it looks cool. It's a really good color scheme too. I think the shade of red is really neat. 6 out of 10. The makeshift armor, generally I don't like costumes that look shitty on purpose, and this is exactly that. The makeshift armor, like it's not even really an armor. It's just gloves, boots, and a fighter pilot helmet. It's really crappy. I routinely forget it even exists in the game, but it's there. 2 out of 10. And I'm only giving it a score that high because it has story significance. If not, 1 out of 10. The prototype suit is one of those things, like, it just makes me question why the makeshift suit exists, but at the same time, it makes me question why the prototype suit is there, because they already had, like, a crummy Iron Man suit for him to use in the campaign because he doesn't have access to his normal costume. So why not just give him the prototype suit to start with? Or conversely, why give him the prototype armor later if you already have the makeshift armor? I don't understand why both of them are there. You only need one of those, but alright, whatever. The prototype suit, 5 out of 10. It's a crappy looking Iron Man suit that's crappy on purpose, but just because it's crappy on purpose, that doesn't take away from the fact that it's crappy. Stark Tech, I feel like I have a pretty similar opinion on that one to his iconic suit. They're pretty similar in design. This one just has more lights on it. 6 out of 10. The suit Vapor Trail is kind of weird. It's one of his better ones, honestly. I don't know what costume is the original one. I'm just using Vapor Trail because I think that one looks the coolest. But it looks alright. I think simply because it has a better helmet design, it looks better than a lot of the other suits in the game. But even then, it's not that good. I'd give it like a 6 out of 10. The Solaris costume legitimately confuses me because the game already has several crummy Iron Man suits. It has the Mark 1, the makeshift suit, and the prototype armor. So here comes a fourth crappy looking hunk of junk Iron Man suit. But this one costs like real money. Why? Who is going to buy this? Who is this for? I don't even understand why it's there. 3 out of 10. The ray gun suit is just, I shit you not, it's just the Solaris costume with saw blades sticking out of it. 2 out of 10. Complete crap. The Iron Knight costume is actually pretty cool. It's basically the same as the Mark 1, but with different textures, a slightly different helmet, slightly different boots, and a cape, but it looks cool. I think it's one of those things that's actually neat. It's one of like the unique costumes that actually like matters, that it's not something from the comic books or from the movies, because it's not really something you'd see from either of those. It has a cape, it looks like an old-timey knight. It looks kind of cool. Not remotely worth its price tag of, I think, $7, but, you know, it's neat. 6.5 out of 10. The Wakandan stealth costume, I see a lot of people praise that one. They're like, oh wow, this one is so unique, it's so cool. It's fine. Like, it's just a black and gold Iron Man. You already had that with the original Sin costume. I guess it's kind of neat, the novelty that is based off of Wakandan stuff. I think it's just okay. Like, I'd give it a 6 out of 10. It's just fine looking. So let's go ahead and look at the suits from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. There are four. Iron Man has four so far, those being the Mark III, the Mark V, the Mark 42, and the Mark 85, otherwise known as the suits from Iron Man 1, Iron Man 2, Iron Man 3, and Avengers Endgame, respectively. I just want to say these four are by far the best suits Iron Man has in this game. They beat the pants off of basically everything else. It's really not even close. I'd say all of them range from like an 8.5 to a 9. They're all pretty good. I don't have many issues with them. The endgame suit, I think the shoulders are a little too small, but like I said before, Iron Man in this game is just proportioned to be puny, so it's not really the costume's fault. The Mark 42 has like a weird gray area near the shoulders that bends like rubber. I don't really like that. But the one I really have issues with is the Mark III. The Mark III is like my favorite Iron Man suit like ever, but man, it is really wonky looking in this game. I just want to say that like these following problems are all like kind of nitpicky. I understand that, but I feel like they need to be said because the suit is not perfect. It has problems. The first is that it's too bright. Specifically, the red on the costume is way too bright. It's way too shiny. If you look at the actual movie, you'll see that like the costume is actually pretty dark in color. Sometimes being so dark that the red looks almost kind of brownish. Whereas it's so bright in the game, it's almost pink at times. I think people confuse the color of this costume because they confuse the Mark III with the suit he wears at the beginning of Iron Man 2, which is actually a different costume, the Mark IV, and it has a slightly different design. Most notably, it's a much brighter shade of red. But like I said, in the actual movie, in the first Iron Man, the suit's pretty dark. So I don't like that. That being said, I would prefer it to be a little brighter than in the movie. I think it was maybe a little too dark in that movie, but it's still too bright. Something like the iconic suit's shade of red, I think that's a better middle ground. Moving on, the shoulders of the costume are too small. They're also just too close to his body. Again, those wonky proportions Iron Man has in this game. So like his shoulder pads are constantly clipping into his chest. Like since they're so small, it makes his head look too big. It's just, I hate his proportions in that game. Something else is the knees. In the movie, he has these knee pads that kind of stick out, but in the game, they're like fully molded to his leg. So instead of the knee pads like sticking out independently of his leg, it's fitted in a way so that whenever he bends his knee, the knee pad bends like rubber, and it just looks gross and cheap. But the biggest issue is the back flaps. I think it was the first Iron Man movie. I think that was the first time Iron Man had those flaps on the back of his costume that would move around when he flew to, make him look more like a human fighter jet. And, this game obviously takes inspiration from the movies with the iconic Iron Man suit having similar back flaps that move around when he flies and stuff. And this costume doesn't have that. The back flaps don't move, which that's like one of the most important elements of the costume is having the back flaps move around. And it's just not there. But even with all that said, I'd still say that the Mark III is the best suit in the game for Iron Man and easily outclasses everything else. So those are all the unique models in the game. I touched on like a few recolors, but I don't want to touch on I don't want to discuss every single recolor because you can just look at them yourself. Most of them are bad, but most of them aren't like abysmally awful. They're in that like gray area between being awful enough that it's burned in your brain and just like passable. So most of them I just forget. If someone wants to make a, reviewing every single costume in the game type video, good luck. Good luck trying to do that. I'm not going to do that. So I hope I've done a pretty good job of looking at every unique Iron Man skin in this game and trying to discuss why I don't think it works very well. But before I close out, I want to address some common defenses I see of these costumes and the practices behind them. Because in case you forgot, most of these suits cost real life money, somewhere between $5 and $15. And when you have that kind of price tag associated with a costume, yeah, I expect more. But I see a lot of defenses of these costumes, and I'd like to take a little bit to address that. Number one, don't like it, don't buy it. Wow, I never thought of that. Thank you so much. That's so helpful. And the thing with this defense is that it's usually used as a way to just silence criticism. Like the mentality behind it is shut up, I don't want to hear what you have to say. If you don't like it, then just shut up and don't say anything, which is really weird because I feel like you should be able to express your dislike with something. Obviously, if you don't like it, truly do not buy it. Because I see the opposite happen where people will complain and whine about a costume and then say, I'm gonna buy it anyway. Which, like, dude, if you do that, all the company is going to see is that you like the costume because you bought it, didn't you? So you're not going to change anything if you buy it anyway. But I think you should be able to not buy it and complain about it, address why you don't like it, why you didn't buy it. That way, maybe, hopefully, the company learns something and tries to fix their mistakes. Number two, it's difficult to translate comic book costumes to a 3D environment. This one just isn't true. It's not difficult to do that. There are multiple video games you can look at that have translated comic book looks to a 3D space and they look fine. Obviously, like Spider-Man PS4 is the big one everyone's going to point to, but there's other games that do that. You look at the Arkham games, they also have costumes from the comic books in relatively realistic looking environments, and they manage to do it pretty faithfully. So sure, it might be a little harder to translate a suit from the comic books to a video game than it would be a suit from the movies to a video game, but it can't be that hard, dude. Number three, it's fine as long as it's recognizable as the suit from the comics. This one is weird because the first thing is that just because it's recognizable as the suit from the comic books, that doesn't mean it's a good interpretation of that suit from the comic books. And the second thing is that a lot of these suits are really not recognizable as the costumes from the comic books. Like, look at the Promethium suit. There's this panel in Ultimate Spider-Man where Tony Stark shows off his huge armory of Iron Man suits. And in the corner, you can see the Promethium armor. And you can identify it even though it's just shown from the neck up due to its unique neck muscle things and the vents. If you were to cut that out and put the video game version of the Promethium armor in that space, would you be able to recognize the Promethium armor from the game as the Promethium armor just by looking at it from the neck up? No, you wouldn't. You wouldn't be able to recognize it as that suit because it's just way too different. So the Promethium armor, I'd say, is neither recognizable as a suit from the comic books, and even if you were to argue that it is, I'd still say that it's not a good interpretation of the suit from the comic books. And yeah, that applies to most of the costumes in the game. Number four, since comic suits are drawn by different people and look different all the time, it's impossible to have something look actually comic book accurate. This is a really weird defense I've seen. Because, yeah, like, costumes are drawn by different artists, and when that happens, they're drawn to look slightly differently. But it's not impossible to have it be comic book accurate. All you have to do is just pick one of those artists and just make it look like that artist's version. That's all you have to do. It's not difficult. Sticking with the Promethium armor, when you look at this picture comparing it to the suit from the comic books, you can tell that in each drawing, the costume looks different. However, the version from the game looks like none of the drawings. Like, literally not even close, like not even a little bit. Also, just for fun, here's a comment that uses multiple of these defenses. I'm going to blur out the name, but if you're in the Avengers community, I think you have a pretty good idea of who this is. I'm just going to say, dude, you and people like you that constantly defend these companies time after time, even though they constantly make these mistakes, and you give them money so that they can continue making these mistakes, congratulations, you're the reason why video games suck nowadays.